Hello, welcome to the Language and Power podcast. I'm Michael Farrelly. Tom Bartlett is here. Hi, Tom.
Hello. Hello.
Our guest today is Auni Ekagwe, and he is from Charles Darwin University in Australia. Today, we are speaking about an article which is about to be published that Auni has written, a CDA PDA of Jewish co-resistance to colonial disinformation. We're really excited to get into the details of that. Hi.
Hi, Michael. Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you.
Great. That's great to have you. We were just talking before the recording. What we've noticed, Michael and I, and the people we've been talking to over this series, is that talking about other people's academic articles has actually been great fun, and it's given people the opportunity to get behind what they're trying to say in articles and expand on stuff. It's given Michael and myself a chance to understand things in a way by speaking to the authors and getting a less technical description. So what we thought we'd do to kick off today's podcast, I'm going to read out the abstract to Auni's article, which I think is absolutely fantastic, and it's very condensed, a lot of exciting ideas. And if I was reading it as an article, I would be highlighting these and saying, well, I want to find out what Auni's going to say about that later on in the article. But of course, we've got the opportunity today to actually ask him in person to expand on these and to go whatever direction it takes him to go behind the article as well. So I'll kick off, if you don't mind, everybody, but just reading out Auni's abstract. So this is in a draft version, might not be the final version of the article. This article argues that disinformation in colonial contexts operates as epistemic and symbolic violence, an ideological camouflage and truth remaking that obscures power asymmetries, systemic inequality and atrocities, distorts moral frameworks, and legitimizes authoritarian or colonial power structures. It examines how Jewish organizations, Jewish Voice for Peace, Breaking the Silence, and Jewish Council Australia construct counter-narratives in response that challenge dominant Zionist framings of the Palestinian struggle while fostering trans-communal communities of trust and pro-Palestinian moral bonds. So forgetting that I've said, in your own terms, Auni, what would you say, where did this article come from and what is it you're trying to do in it?
Well, this article came from the current engagement of alternative Jewish movements, using Judith Butler's terms, and what these alternative Jewish movements are doing to co-resist colonial framing of the goings-on in Palestine with reference to the ongoing genocide in Gaza. I noticed that not all Jewish communities have similar stance towards what's going on. And to be honest, many of them are against the crimes committed in Gaza, including the apartheid and the illegal occupation in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So that said, it is still under-researched how these alternative Jewish movements operate and use discourse to construct communities of truth about what's going on in Palestine and to construct transcommunal bodies or affiliations that are based on ethics and moral orders, shared moral orders that might be related to international law, cultural moral orders, institutional moral orders, and so on. So my study looks at how Jewish activists and human rights organizations use language to counter disinformation on Palestine and moral distortions surrounding the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And I try to offer a new perspective, or a new take on the matter, combining CDA, PDA perspective. And we often hear about disinformation from governments, mainstream media, or political leaders. But what's less explored is how grassroots or activist groups resist those narratives, especially when they challenge powerful or colonial truth claims. This article argues that disinformation in colonial contexts operates as epistemic and symbolic violence, and I'll come to what I mean by these. And they operate as an ideological camouflage and truth remaking that obscures power asymmetries, systemic inequality, atrocities, and moral frameworks, including international legal moral orders. So I draw on complementary CDA, PDA approach to foreground discourse as a site of hope and positive change, while the discourse of these Jewish alternative movements expose injustices, inequalities, and the commodification of truth. At the heart of the colonial framing of what is going on in Palestine is strategic framing practices. And that operates to shape perceptions, beliefs, and people's behaviors. Yet little is known how these alternative Jewish movements leverage framing as a social discursive practice and relational bonding and moral positioning to resist this colonial disinformation and immoral framing and reconfigure collective moral understanding. So I focus mainly on Jewish Voice for Peace, B'Tselem, and Breaking the Silence, as well as the Jewish Council of Australia. Why these organizations in particular? Judith Butler and a large number of Jewish scholars call for a rupture from the Zionist discourse around Palestine. They consider Zionism as a subtler colonial movement from which Jewish communities should be divorced and should rally around and bond together based on humanized and true Jewishness, not the conflated state between Zionism and Jewishness. When it comes to B'Tselem, for example, it is an independent Israeli human rights organization that documents violations in the occupied Palestinian territories. Through its works, including discursive work, it aims to expose apartheid conditions and advocate for equality and justice. By doing that, it co-resists the status quo, working together with the Palestinian movements, such as the BDS movement. Although it doesn't coordinate its work with the BDS movement and other Palestinian movements, they share the same humanized and moral ethics. The same applies to Jewish Council Australia. It is a coalition of Jewish individuals, intellectuals, lawyers, etc., advocating for human rights, anti-racism, and Palestinian freedom. Breaking the Silence comprises Israeli military veterans who expose the realities of occupation through personal testimonies. So they've been to the IDF and they know what crimes IDF is committing in Palestine. And these insider accounts reveal the contradictions between official state narratives and lived military experiences. The same applies to Jewish Voice for Peace. It is a progressive, anti-Zionist Jewish organization. It advocates for the liberation of Palestinians and Jews alike. It centers racial justice, anti-colonial ethics, and solidarity across identity lines. What attracted me to this topic is the potential these discourses have in countering disinformation, activating shared moral orders, positioning self and others based on these activated moral orders, and suggesting a way ahead for the Jewish communities as well as those who share the same worldview. And this makes it an excellent case for PDA-CDA case study, which attracted me to look at how the same discourse can achieve all this at once.
Fabulous. Thank you. Can I just ask you to talk about absolutely amazing? One or two things that we want to unpack a little bit, linguistic terms that we use that are sort of semi-transparent, but maybe need a little bit of work when you talk about that. I think one of the things that comes out there and that's really important for what you're doing and how we as discourse analysts become interventionist or positive discourse analysts, you talk about framing and understanding. So these touch on the borders between linguistics and comprehension, but also activated moral orders that come in there. Can you explain what you mean by that? Because I think that gives us and the listenership an understanding of what the role of a discourse analyst might be then if we talk about what you mean by framing, how that interacts with the understanding of different people, when you're talking about activated moral orders, why that's important and what we work on. Could you sort of explain in basic terms what you mean by framing, what you mean by activated moral order?
Absolutely. Well, by bringing SFL and CDM moral positioning together to explain how language enacts moral resistance in the context of colonial disinformation, I believe these concepts are at the heart of this project. Most existing studies on disinformation or activism focus on ideology, persuasion, or framing in quite general terms. What they often miss is how moral meanings are built linguistically. By this, I'm referring to how compassion and acts of solidarity are enacted, as well as acts of condemnation. how they are realized in language, and how these meanings mobilize social action. That's why I find it very important to introduce several innovations to the current literature. Conceptually speaking, this work redefines tenor as an ethical tenor, showing how activists negotiate moral relations. I developed the idea of moral field out of what Van Langenhove and other psychologists refer to as strategic moral orders. And here they refer to shared legal moral value system, cultural value system, and institutional value system as broad moral orders within which people can operate and regulate their rights and obligations. So this idea of moral field that activists activate through the use of language, particularly through attitudinally loaded language or ideational meanings that invoke attitude, that index or refer to particular moral orders. For example, the mention of the word genocide will activate a legal moral order, particularly the Genocide Convention. This is just an example. I can give more examples later. Analytically speaking, I find it very important to introduce the notion of evaluative couplings, which is used in SFL, iconization, and bond clustering as mechanisms for constructing moral alignments and moral disalignments. These tools can help us reveal how words, values, and identities combine to form moral communities of feelings and action, which I call discursive moral orders. Methodologically speaking, the study tries to operationalize moral positioning within an SFL framework. So moral positioning theory is coming from sociology and psychology, but I'm trying to operationalize it within an SFL framework. Rather than analyzing only what activists say, I try to show the potential linguistic patterns like evaluation, alignment, axiological triggers, etc., and how they have the potential to generate moral action and reframe disinformation. Here, I can give more elaboration in relation to moral orders, particularly taking these moral orders as moral fields. The language used in discourse can guide value system and can guide or orient the audience aesthetically, emotionally, and ethically. Once these moral fields activated in discourse, they have the potential to reveal the foundations underpinning individual, collective, and institutional participation for the defense of the Palestinian rights, human rights, and to hold accountable those involved in the genocide. And once activated, these moral fields enable morally activated solidarity and transformative agency, because they will serve as reference point to those engaged in the actions encouraged by these alternative Jewish movements. These moral fields serve as a site for value alignment, bonding, solidarity, and building.
Could you talk through an example of what you've just spoken about to kind of give us a sense of what are you actually seeing in the text and the discourse that you're analyzing and put a bit of extra meaning onto that?
Absolutely. So let's take an example related to evaluative couplings, the pairing of attitudinal expression with the attitudinal target, that is the ideation. Evaluative couplings can construct interpersonal bonds in terms of the interpersonal relationships that interpersonal meanings can enact and through discourse. These bonds can generate cohesion or opposition, fostering solidarity or resistance. In the Jewish Council Australia's statement, for example, with each passing day, it becomes clearer that Israel is a rogue state. We say this as part of a large and growing number of Jews who have been calling for a ceasefire for many months and saying that Israel actions are completely incompatible with our Jewish values. So here we have two negative couplings appearing in this statement, which can be annotated as Israel coupled with negative judgment, that is, Israel is a rogue state, instantiating a rogue Israel bond around which the audience can rally. The second coupling is Israel's actions coupled with incompatible with Jewish values, instantiating a Jewish moral divergence bond. These instantiated bonds can jointly position Israel as both politically and morally deviant persona constructed in discourse, or a rogue state, which serves to legitimize this alignment from its actions and alignment with the broader international moral order or Jewish values constructed in discourse. The same applies to the use of axiologically charged ideations, such as terms that inherently encode judgment within legal, institutional, or cultural discourses. For example, the use of words such as genocide to frame what's going on in Palestine, in Gaza, or apartheid in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the word complicity, war crime, unlawful occupation, racism. So these axiologically charged ideations encode negative judgment of what Israel is doing. The same applies to what Martin and Michel Zabavina term as axiotic, that is axiological terms, axiological technical terms, or specialized ideational triggers that activate moral evaluations. The same applies to icons or entities, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations, and iconic figures such as Mandela, to rally around working hard towards freedom to get rid of an apartheid regime. So these axiologically charged terms and icons carry dense affiliative significance. And the same applies to the mention of Netanyahu when coupled with war criminal as a phrase mentioned in these alternative Jewish movements and discourses. This coupling can function as a moral anti-icon to represent opposing value system. So once we can track all these bonds being activated in discourse, we can cluster them, group them based on either the polarity, positive, negative bond cluster, or based on the underpinning moral order, institutional or legal or cultural moral order, or based on whom these values or bonds serve.
Okay. So I'm not an SFL or systemic functional linguist by trade. Could you explain a little bit more what exactly is a bond cluster technically, and then give an example of that?
Absolutely. I imagine that we agree on what a bond is and how it is instantiated in discourse. So bond clustering occurs when multiple key bonds co-occur in discourse and reinforce one another. In the examples I gave above, which illustrate two bonds related to Israel, these two bonds, as well as other key bonds related to Israel and that portrays Israel negatively or positions Israel in a negative light, form a negative cluster around Israel's actions. The generative role of these bond clusters lies in their capacity to amplify, sustain, and spread ideological and ethical positions, enhancing the persuasive force of this discourse as well as the moral clarity. So bonds can be clustered positively and negatively. So we end up having a positive cluster and negative cluster, which can be used to promote compassion or condemnation. We can argue for a negative bond cluster that typically pulls the audience away from the ideational targets, such as Israel, encouraging rejection, disapproval, or moral disalignment from its actions. And when it comes to positive bond cluster, here, it, by contrast, pulls the audience towards certain targets and actions, inviting acceptance, moral affiliation, and compassionate alignment. Bond clusters can also be categorized based on us versus them, but in relation to the context of this study, it's not about an ideological us versus them. It's about an ethical, who is compliant in the eyes of the legal, the universal moral order, for example, and who's constructed as deviant from that moral order. We can also cluster bonds based on different moral orders. So we end up with moral order-centered clusters, anchoring discourse in legal moral order, cultural moral order, or institutional norms. Some bonds might be related to harm being imposed on the Palestinian. We can call that harm-centered bond cluster. Some other bonds might be related to acts of care and compassion we need to show towards the Palestinian. And then we can describe or cluster these bonds based on care, and we call it care-centered cluster. These clusters are crucial in enacting moral positioning in activist discourse. Through them, social actors are framed as either upholding or violating specific moral fields, helping construct ethical boundaries and legitimizing alignment or resistance. A summary of what analytical categories we can use from an SFL perspective for coding these bonds. We can rely on evaluative couplings, axiatic terms, axicons, and bondicons. And by focusing on repeated bonds for forming cohesive ideological groupings or ethical groupings, we can imagine the bond clusters.
So when you talk about axiomatic terms, axicons and so on, could you just give us a very simple definition of what those are? And I think what I'll do is I'll put those in earlier on.
Absolutely. So to start with, evaluative couplings are pairings of a target of attitudinal meaning with the attitudinal targets. So Israel coupled with rogue state. Axiatic terms are specialized ideational triggers that are inherently charged with moral evaluation, as in the case of using terms such as genocide, apartheid, war crime. So they activate moral framing in institutional or legal discourses. Axicons is about axiological icons or entities carrying evaluative significance, such as the reference to Universal Declaration of Human Rights, now reference to Mandela and his actions. And these function to anchor solidarity and positive moral bonding. When we talk about bonding icons, we talk about icons of positive solidarity used to rally affiliative bonds. Jewish Voice for Peace and B'Tselem and all these Jewish alternative movements construct themselves at the end of the day as bondicons. So people can rally around them as icons that work towards respect for humanized values and systemic compassion against systemic violence. When I talk about anti-icons or anticons, here we talk about icons such as the apartheid wall that divide the Palestinian territories. We talk about Zionism as brownwashing, as used in this discourse. So the use of these anti-icons represents opposing moral system and operates to anchor disalignment and moral opposition. Hopefully these definitions and examples help. But I wanted to mention that these bonds are being deployed or mobilized in discourse against the colonial framing of what is going on in Palestine. So what is the story that colonial powers are trying to sell? These Jewish alternative movements, as well as pioneering Jewish scholars such as Judith Butler and Ilan Pappé, a new historian, consider Zionism as a settler colonial movement. It is a political movement that is separate from Jewishness as religion. And this settler colonial movement tends to describe Israel, for example, despite all crimes committed, as the only democracy in the Middle East, and to describe Palestine as being found as empty land. Zionists invested in the Palestinian territories and brought life to it. They describe whatever lands taken over by illegal settlers as disputed land, still disputed land. And so we can take over until we figure out what people would say about it. These are not disputed land. There is international law, and there are ICJ's orders and advisory opinion on the legal status of the occupied Palestinian territories, as well as the United Nations resolutions on these lands. So if we focus on this colonial frame, disputed land, and how it operates and why these Jewish alternative movements find it necessary to redefine what's going on in Palestine from a legal and moral perspective. Disputed land is a great example, which sounds neutral on the surface, but it is actually powerful from the colonial framing perspective. When we call occupied Palestinian territories disputed, we are not just describing geography, we are erasing history. The word disputed implies two equal sides in an argument, like neighbors disagreeing over a fence. But in reality, this is not a simple disagreement. It's a situation of military occupation and disposition recognized in international law. So the language shifts our moral and political understanding from occupation, which implies illegality and responsibility, to dispute, which implies symmetry and negotiation. This is what I mean by colonial framing. Language hides the power imbalance and sensitizes colonial violence. It's part of a broader discursive strategy that rebrands colonization as security, self-defense, or conflict management. Jewish scholars, such as Judith Butler, say that it makes no sense to treat the relations between Israel and Palestine as two sides of a conflict, since such framing effaces the inequality on the ground. And what my study does is tracing how Jewish human rights and activist organizations resist this framing and present alternative framing, grounded in shared moral order. Through their
Can I just pick up on that?
Yeah.
I find that's really interesting. What you're saying is there's the hegemonic, or the one that we hear most of the time, the Zionist framing, the organizations you look at through your text analysis and through the linguistic features and mechanisms you talk about, you're able to recognize this alternative framing, which is a counter framing to the dominant one. Your choice of articles is very interesting, because a few times you've stressed that Judith Butler is a Jewish intellectual, etc. How important is it, you think, in the project, the PDA, the Positive Discourse Analysis Project, or Critical Discourse Analysis Project, that you chose these Jewish voices to present the counterframing? You didn't create the Western political establishment counterframing, or, white Celtic guys like me counterframing. Why is it really, what's the importance of drawing your data from these Jewish sources as the sources of the counterframing? Can you explain the importance of that?
It's a very interesting question. Thanks, Tom. Well, I think that takes us back to why I chose CDA-PDA perspective from the very beginning. Well, 2 decades ago, Jim Martin proposed positive discourse analysis as a complement to CDA, but work on that complementary side is still rare. But we can learn from that early work that focused on Nelson Mandela's speech, for example, that if discourse analysts are serious about wanting to use their work to enact social change, then, according to Jim Martin, they will have to broaden their coverage to include discourse of this kind, discourse that inspires, encourages, heartens, discourse we like, or that cheers us along. But this kind of discourse doesn't do that, although it does a job dealing with texts that can contribute to positive social change. But it's not the kind of discourse that encourages, heartens, and a discourse that we admire. So we need to look at this discourse as having the potential to bring about positive social change in Jim Martin's terms, but to understand how that can be done. That can be done by acts of resistance, by critiquing the injustices that are there. So the critical aspect and the positive aspect should come together. So if we look at Ruth Woodruff and Michael Mayer's work, for example, they emphasize that CDA is fundamentally interested in analyzing relationships of dominance, discrimination, power, and control as manifested in language. And this is very relevant to the discourses I'm looking at. If we look at Van Dyke, we find that CDA primarily studies the way social power, abuse, dominance, and inequality are enacted, reproduced, and resisted So I'm focusing on this function in particular, how these acts of abuse, dominance, and inequality are resisted by text and talk in the social and political context. These Jewish alternative movement discourses help us understand how language can be used to resist abuse, dominance, and equality, and then instill hope and work or operate to bring about positive change. And all these functions can be captured in this kind of discourse. And this might lead me to the point mentioned in Tom Bartlett's work on positive discourse analysis, where he argues for proposing alternatives that come up from the work of local forces, local groups, local contexts. In this case, some of the organizations operate in Israel itself and some operate elsewhere. So they represent that kind of local uptake on what's going on in Israel and the Jewish communities either in Israel and beyond that. But I found in these discourses of Jewish alternative movements that they are not proposing alternative spaces where the Zionists can come and sit with them to find a solution. No, they are calling for rupture from Zionism and bringing all Jewish communities around Jewishness as shared values, not Zionism as shared values. This is emphasized in Naomi Klein's work. Naomi Klein is an activist and a scholar who works with Jewish Voice for Peace in the USA. She describes what is needed for the Jewish communities is an exodus from Zionism, which she likens to the worship of a false idol. And she describes Zionism as a betrayal of Jewish ethical traditions. And that's why I'm interested in Jewishness as a moral framework within which this discourse operates in addition to other moral orders. So I think this form of resistance and co-resistance, because they are supporting the Palestinians' right, and thus they are partners in peace in Judith Butler's terms. This co-resistance doesn't seek compromise or third spaces with Zionism, but rather calls for an ethical rupture, an exodus from what is seen as a deeply immoral path. And in her latest article in The Guardian, Naomi Klein declares Zionism as a false idol that takes our most profound biblical stories of justice and emancipation from slavery and turns them into brutalist weapons of colonial land theft, roadmaps for ethnic cleansing and genocide. In her words, Zionism is a false idol that has taken the transcendent idea of the promised land, a metaphor for human liberation that has traveled across multiple faiths to every corner of this globe, and dared to turn it into a deed of sale for militaristic ethno-state. She emphasizes that political Zionism's version of liberation is itself profane, and this false idol of Zionism equates Israeli safety with Egyptian dictatorship and client states. From the start, it has produced an ugly kind of freedom that saw Palestinian children not as human beings, but as demographic threats, much as the Pharaoh in the book of Exodus feared the growing population of Israelites and thus ordered the death of their sons. You can see the rupture between Zionism and Jewishness as defended by these Jewish alternative movements.
Well, fantastic. And that's the point I'm getting at. So when you talk about where Jim came in, when he talks about texts that inspire us and that we are turned on by and all that, who's the we? This is the thing I go back to. And I think what your work's doing is my critique of positive discourse analysis in the Martinian framework, and that we've mentioned in previous episodes of this podcast and that I've written about, is that it's not, who is it up to make this critique? The fact that I find a particular text inspiring or enlightening doesn't mean that the next person will. That's my own point of view. But what I find interesting about your work is, though you're talking about the rupture between Zionism and Jewishness, the way you've been describing it and the way the authors you quote describe it is, this is a debate that's held within the terms of Jewishness. They are arguing that there's a deeper and higher level of what it means to be Jewish and the Jewish moral framework. As a good Jew, if you were to adhere to that and take it seriously, you would see that Zionism is an aberration. This is an argument that comes out of Jewishness, that comes out of Jewish theology, Jewish sociology, all these things, not from me sitting on my academic ivory tower saying, I like this text, I don't like this text. And I think that's essential. It brings in the point that there is no absolute truth. If I try and argue with Trumpian Christians and just say they're wrong, they're not interested in what I have to say because I'm the bad guy. But if people within Christianity try and argue with Trumpians that they are being anti-Christian, then hopefully the hope is that people who, if they are genuinely Christian, will rethink how they can possibly be Trumpian and a Christian at the same time. So that has to come from within that community. So it's immanent analysis. It comes from the group itself. It doesn't come from an outside analyst wanting to say what they like and what they want to happen. And so I think you're capturing that brilliantly. We're emphasizing the rupture within what should be harmony, this higher order understanding of what it means to be Jewish. And that's something that can only come out of the community itself. It's not something we as analysts sitting back at home can critique.
This is a very important point that you highlighted, but I want to highlight another point, that is our work as discourse analysts and the kind of discourse we are looking at. So this is a discourse that is used and constructed by alternative Jewish movements. Given the circumstances in Palestine and in Gaza in particular, being strategic about the choice of text that we analyze as discourse analysts is by itself a message, and it's not an option. I think it is a moral imperative. We need to foreground this kind of discourse, and we draw some lessons that inform the design of discourses that can encourage people to introduce change or to work towards the positive change they dream of. So there are two things. So the discourse itself is produced by Jewish alternative movements. The other point is our work as discourse analysts. I think it's kind of luxury to focus on probably the difference between, let's say, copula and other stuff in linguistics when genocide is going on. So we need to be strategic about what to focus on, what kind of discourse analysis to undertake. And in relation to what you just mentioned, Tom, the main point that Jewish alternative movements focus on is that what we hear in the media that is complicit in the genocide itself is a campaign of disinformation. So they are trying to raise awareness about what's going on and establish shared moral orders. Against these shared moral orders, we need to judge our actions or the Israeli government's actions, etc. So according to the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report, disinformation is about the deliberate spread of false information. And it is widely spread through media networks and contributes to shifting public opinion in a significant way towards distrust in facts and authority. We notice that anyone who tries to work towards the human rights of the Palestinian, even the Secretary General of the United Nations, they are labeled as Hamas. It's a smear campaign in addition to disinformation. So disinformation, back to the point of disinformation, amplifies the other leading factors we face, such as state-based armed conflict, practices of apartheid, etc. So disinformation has the capacity to destabilize the world and legitimize colonial power structures. That is why these Jewish alternative movements are interested in raising awareness about what's going on and to counter this kind of disinformation through challenging the colonial framing themselves. So in the context of Palestine, disinformation operates to obscure and reframe historical and ongoing atrocities. It euphemistically recasts ethnic cleansing that started in 1948 and documented in the Jewish new historian Ilan Pappé's work, recasts ethnic cleansing as security measures and genocide as self-defense. As highlighted in Francesca Albanese's Anatomy of Genocide report, we can see a lot of such examples. So this use of language commodifies the truth to legitimize state-sanctioned aggression. And the Jewish alternative movements find themselves in a position where challenging this disinformation serves Jewish communities worldwide. And denying Palestinian rights risks the safety of Jewish communities. They emphasize on this point. It's not the work of Netanyahu's government that protects the Jewish communities from the anti-Semitism. It is what Netanyahu's government is doing that poses risk against the Jewish communities. So this disinformation about Palestine is also about silencing the truth tellers, even when truth tellers are coming from Jewish communities inside or outside Israel. And we notice that in Ilan Pappé's work, the most recent 2 books, when he talks about how pro-Israel actors in the UK and the USA and elsewhere try to cancel settler colonialism and Palestine conferences at the University of Exeter and other universities as a matter of objecting even to the term Palestine. They don't want the mention of the word Palestine until we came to the moment where even the U.S. Secretary to Israel is saying there isn't such thing as Palestine, the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So against this, these acts of erasure and disinformation in Palestine, these Jewish alternative movements are operating, and they find establishing shared moral orders as the basis for bonding. It is bonding based on humanized bonds and values and broad moral orders that everyone can agree on. So based on this, we can understand bonding as a deontic alignment practice anchored in truth and moral systems such as international law, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the ICJ's rulings or orders, which signals rights, obligations, and expectations.
I agree with a lot of what you're saying. You talk about bonding, and I'm going to ask you bonding with whom. But you've also mentioned universal assumptions of morality. These don't exist. This is a myth. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is really the Declaration of Human Rights according to the worldview of a few very powerful nations. It's not shared by an awful lot of humanity that these are universal moral truths. So when you're saying they're creating bonds, when we can look at it at a textual level and see that they do this through linguistics, who is it that they're making bonds with that's going to change the situation on the ground? Just critiquing something, saying it's wrong, saying it's genocide according to international law, doesn't seem to be changing the situation on the ground. So what I'm suggesting is these articles have to make moral bonds with the enemy if you want the enemy to change, or the antagonist, the protagonist, if you want the enemy to change, or else it's virtue signaling in its worst, at the most extreme case. So that's what I'm saying to you, just highlighting injustices, saying they're illegal, saying they're immoral against your own code. There is no universal code. This is my question. How do we make this effective? How do we take it beyond text? And that's why I think it's really important it's coming from the Jewish community, because they've got a chance of creating a shared Jewish moral order that might persuade enough proponents of Zionism to change. Never everybody, but enough to change the shift. So I'm a bit dubious about universal and things we can all agree on and truth. I think these are very slippery concepts.
To a certain extent, I agree with you. The point here is not about universal values. They are humanized values, and values that are enshrined in Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Whether Israel excludes itself from this declaration or not, that is another problem. It is endorsed by all nations around the world. International law is for all nations around the world. But of course, it comes when those violating international law and these values are the superpowers, the colonial powers, etc., which calls for resistance. And these Jewish alternative movements in their discourses suggest the kind of actions that should be taken to challenge what's going on. It's not only about bonding, but also about prescribing and describing what should be done. For example, they say that acts of BDS is the only way to end the Israeli crimes against the Palestinians. So they call explicitly for divestments, to pressure businesses that operate in Israel to boycott them, and then that pressure will force these businesses to divest from Israel or the illegal settlements. They call for boycotting Israel-produced products. They call for boycotting, divestment, and imposing sanctions on Israel for violating international law, etc. Some countries like Spain has started, which means things can be done. And these are the kinds of doable actions and plans or agendas that the Jewish alternative movements are pushing. So they start by establishing these bonds and then to challenge the status quo and what the Israeli propaganda and the colonial framing is doing. By that, they managed to win more voices in the USA. And the latest polls show that more and more young people are joining these free voices, criticizing Israel and taking actions against Israel, writing to their representatives, boycotting some products, etc. So there are some actions being taken after these shared bonds are established. So if we look at, for example, some key bonds and bond clusters in the Jewish Voice for Peace, we would see work and calls around equality, dignity, accountability, justice, etc. Accountability as the foundation for moving forward, and what kind of practices are entrenched in Israel. The youth in the USA, particularly the Jewish community's youth, are not fully aware of what's going on in Palestine. They don't see it as an occupation. So these Jewish alternative movements are emphasizing that it is an occupation, and people are hearing this word for the first time. So they are doing a job there by mobilizing these kinds of bonds as a step towards mobilizing actions towards winning for the human rights of the Palestinians. I wanted to touch on the kind of bond clusters that emerged from the text I looked at. For example, I found that there are convergent bond clusters being constructed again and again through these discourses against divergent bond clusters. So Israel is coupled with Zionism, war crimes, domination, disposition, supremacy, fear, estrangement, norms that are specific for the Ashkenazi Jews, not other Jews, just to highlight that kind of racism within the Israeli society itself. In contrast to that divergent bond clusters, we have convergent bond clusters that present Jewish Voice for Peace, for example, as a powerful movement that can create change. It's about justice, equality, freedom, etc. Readers can identify or co-identify with these meanings and decide to take sides, and then that prepares them to take steps towards the prescribed actions. In my paper published last year on BDS movements, I focused on the kind of acts of BDS that are being recommended in Discourse and how Discourse does that and position people to take action towards these actions constructed in Discourse.
Thanks for that. I wonder if you could, again, taking on that theme that you were talking about, some of those raw examples, I wonder if there's a particular example that you could talk all the way through from your data in the article and then refer that back to some of the concepts that you've spoken about, because it'd be good to know about some of the key words that you found in these counter discourses, some of the key bonds, some of those bond clusters, and see not just isolated examples, but the bigger picture of what the counter framing looks like.
Yeah, I'm happy to share some examples. I'll read some excerpts from the Breaking the Silence movement to illustrate this. So counter framing as a complementary analysis that is undertaken in this discourse actually shows that Jewish Voice for Peace contests dominant Zionist framings by reframing Israeli action as ideologically driven and legally indefensible. Evaluative language such as ethnostate and routine bombings portrays Israeli policies as settler, colonial, and genocidal, foregrounding Palestinian suffering and shifting agency from individuals to state structures. And bonding strategies here, particularly the converging and diverging, that is distancing from Zionism, and deontic, that is the moral imperative, construct an effective moral economy aligned with justice and co-resistance. And these strategies illustrate how digital platforms can amplify ethically grounded discourse and amplify transnational awareness of state-perpetrated injustice. Moving to the second example related to the break in the silence, I'd love to read some example coming from an Instagram post, and it reads as follows. Without the state, settlers are powerless. A confession by a military person. We don't want to talk about settlers, really. Not because they aren't significant, They are, but they are only part of the problem, because alone, the settlers are powerless. Their power comes from state institutions, all of them, from local councils to IDF. And the post continues, there is no way to discuss IDF missions in the OPT without mentioning settlers, and it's impossible to speak to settler violence while omitting the IDF. Last month, 71-year-old amateur archaeologist Ziv Aklesh was killed in Lebanon, along with a young IDF soldier. We've known Erlish for decades, from soldier testimonies on similar trips he has done in the West Bank to prove that there was a Jewish presence in certain mosques. It's your responsibility to be responsible for anything that Erlish wants. The unit commander, with authorization from the brigade commander, confirmed this narrative, which is mentioned in that post. The post continues talking about efforts related to archaeology, that as a tactic that is used to legitimize the invasion of other countries based on created and constructed presence of the Jews in certain places. So it is a tactic by the states. By going through these examples and posts, we can notice that breaking the silence reframes settler violence and settler colonialism as a state-sanctioned system by foregrounding ideological language across its posts, such as apartheid, settler violence, forcible displacement, and messianic goals, ecological missions, etc. It shifts agency from individuals to institutions, to state-sanctioned practices, such as settlers using IDF soldiers as their own private bodyguards. This constructs Israel's military presence as complicit in settler violence and cannot declare that it has no relationship with unlawful settlements. So the breaking the silence discourse emphasizes institutional structures over individual suffering. And the grammatical choices here, such as passives, homes are routinely demolished, or nominalization, the infrastructure for resettling Gaza is being prepared, serve to depersonalize state actions to amplify systemic control. And this illustrates how discourse can reveal structural mechanisms of oppression, offering a model for analyzing state violence in other conflict zones. When we zoom in on the kind of bonds being constructed in such posts, we can see divergence bonds that critique settler state complicity, as in settlers are only as strong as the soldiers guarding them. And divergence bonds critique IDF as well as the state and the settlers themselves. And deontic bonds or convergence bonds call for institutional critique. So breaking the silence by relying on these framing strategies and constructing divergent and convergent bonds ethically positions itself as a truth teller within nested moral field related to the legal moral order or the cultural Jewish moral order and political moral order within which the veterans were operating. They are reporting their testimonies, challenging hegemonic narratives and activist complacency. Such approaches suggest that ethically oriented activist communication can strengthen civic accountability and inspire global audiences to critically interrogate state-sanctioned harm. We can use this kind of discourse to build evidence against the practices of the state of Israel, against the rights of the Palestinians.
Thank you for that. I think we're pushing up against time. Tom, is there anything else you wanted to?
No, I think the boundaries of time opened up so many fascinating areas for linguistic analysis, connecting it to social situations and critique. If we push the boundary of time, we might end up going for another 3 weeks on this discussion. It's going to be a discussion that has to be continued, but really, really, really interesting stuff that's grounded in linguistic analysis and goes all the way up to very, all the theoretical, political, sociological stuff you're you're talking about, that just shows the power that we can have harnessed through linguistic analysis to use for these things. A continuing discussion, definitely, because it's a fascinating area that's still emerging.
Absolutely.
Well,
Thank you
I'd
so
like to
much
thank,
for speaking with us.
not at all. I'd like to thank both of you for having me. And I'd like probably to conclude by two lines, one coming from Ilan Pepe, who's an Israeli new historian, and another by Judith Butler. Butler emphasizes that a Jewish critique of Israeli state violence is ethically obligatory for Jewish communities, including those Jewish alternative movements that should emerge as partners for peace and co-resistance. And the last line is coming from Ilan Pepe, who says that the desperate and disastrous scenario that is playing out in front of our eyes should push us to believe in humanity and the power of justice to carve a different way forward. And I believe us as discourse analysts can play a major role where activism is not anymore an option, but it is a moral imperative. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Amni.
And just to let you know, Tom and myself, along with Michael Kranert and Jane Mulderig, are running an in-person workshop for PhD students and early career researchers on critical discourse analysis. If you're listening to the podcast as it comes out, the workshop, if you're interested, will be in Sheffield in the UK on the 15th and 16th of January 2026. Booking is open and the details are on the website for Discourse Academy, and there's a link in the show description. Thank you.